Welcome back to the Living Wisdom podcast. Today is a dialogue about Be Right Back with Simon DeDeo, whom I'll introduce in a few minutes. But before we begin that dialogue, I would like to first summarize the monologues that precede this dialogue in the order of the Living Wisdom podcast. So there are three of them. The first was about Solomon, Robert Solomon, the American existentialist, with a little assist from Ovid, the Roman poet of the first century. The second of the monologues was about Freud, particularly his short essays Mourning and Melancholia, and then Repeating, Remembering, and Working Through. And finally, Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist from France in the mid-20th century, Being and Nothingness, an excerpt from that about love and the paradox of love. So let me just begin by summarizing the independent ideas and then giving a sense of how I think they fit together. So first, Ovid. Ovid tells the story of Pygmalion, a misogynist who gives up on women and decides to create a statue of the perfect woman, with whom he then falls in love and prays to Aphrodite that she be made a real girl. Aphrodite grants his wish, and he impregnates her. And that's the end of the story in the Metamorphoses, the book in which Ovid tells that story. But the Metamorphoses is a series of stories, and in subsequent stories we discover that the offspring of that union between Pygmalion and his statue girl is cursed. So Ovid, although not directly in that story, more in the broad scope of the Metamorphoses, is, I think, telling us that a relationship between a creator and his creation is doomed in some way. In Robert Solomon, we have, as I mentioned, an American existentialist of the late 20th century. I think he died in 2007. And he gives us a theory of the emotions, according to which emotions are judgments. That's a theory that stems from the Stoics in antiquity, who thought that emotions weren't just irrational passions, but were rather judgments about goodness and badness and in situations relative to oneself. And Solomon expands that theory, arguing that in every emotion, what we have is a judgment about ourselves and its relationship, especially to the social world. He thinks that we're making judgments about our status, what it should be, what it is, what it was, where it's going. So, for example, when I feel anger because you've said something to me, I judge that my status relative to you is not what it should be. You've disrespected me. And anger just is the judgment. It's not that anger follows from the judgment, but anger simply is the judgment. So we have a set of these judgments all the time, which is to say we're feeling emotions all the time. And Solomon thinks that that set of judgments has a character. Much like in politics, there is a set of legal judgments that judges make that are based on laws, which are more stable than the particular judgments of the judges. And then below those laws is, at least in the American case, a constitution, something that orients the laws. And Solomon spells out that analogy in much more detail than I'm able to do now, but that each person has an emotional constitution that underwrites the particular emotional judgments of our day-to-day lives. That emotional constitution he calls a surreality, rather than a reality. So, speak of reality, a dog comes into a room, that's just a fact, but two people will experience that dog very differently. One person will go over and pet the dog, another person will cower behind the couch. They are experiencing different emotions. Clearly, one's experiencing fear, and one might be experiencing joy or love. And those are features of their surreality, that the second person, the person who's afraid, lives in a fear-filled world, at least relative to dogs. Solomon thinks that we're living in a surreality all the time. And in that episode, I talk about Plato's cave to some extent, that we can think of ourselves as living in emotional caves that are different from the reality. So in reality, in that instance, simply a dog walks into the room, but we experience it, in at least the one person did, as a fearful object walks into the room. And that's neither true nor false. That's simply what we're experiencing. Now, Freud, to move on, distinguishes between mourning and melancholia. Mourning is, or grieving, is when we lose an object of our love, either to death or divorce or betrayal or what have you. And that's a normal emotional process, that we love that person. In Freud's quasi-technical terminology, we have libido or desire for that person, and he imagines it really spatially, dynamically as as a going out of energy towards that object. But then when that object, that love object, disappears, again through death or divorce or whatever, that energy continues to go out and is frustrated because there's no thing on which it can discharge. Freud has this kind of quasi-electronic metaphor. At any rate, in mourning, what we learn to do is to withdraw the libido away from that absence. And then because he thinks that we have a continuous reservoir of a certain amount of libido, we now have energy freed up to reinvest into another person. So this would be straightforwardly, somebody dies, somebody leaves you or whatever, and you mourn, which is the process of withdrawing the libido and redirecting it so that you can have a new relationship. Now, I combine Solomon and Freud by saying what's happening in mourning is originally there's a surreality that has, let's say, at its center a person, a love object, a spouse, a parent, a child, or whatever, and that when that person disappears through death or divorce or whatever, the surreality remains. It's not like somebody dies and then the next day you just wake up and go on as if they didn't exist. Your whole emotional constitution is still oriented around that person. Now that person is gone, so it's oriented around an absence. What you have to do then is, leaving aside now the Freudian terminology of withdrawing and libido and so on, I think the better terminology is Solomon's. You have to learn how to reconstitute your surreality. You have to relearn how to make emotional judgments. Most importantly, that the person's not there any longer. Because Freud has the advantage of distinguishing between conscious and unconscious emotions, or conscious and unconscious judgments. You can judge that the person is no longer there the day after they're dead, but something in you is going to act as if they're still alive. That's what takes the work of change. And I think Solomon gives us the terminology to describe what the change is. Namely, you've got to learn how to make new emotional judgments. That's the problem with the melancholic, according to Freud, as opposed to the mourner. The melancholic, when the love object disappears, the melancholic doesn't withdraw the libido and then learn to reattach it somewhere else. Instead, the melancholic withdraws the entire relationship. So it's as if the love object itself is being pulled into the soul. And again, it's not that you take the dead body and put it into your brain, but you're rather, I think, just keeping alive an image, an internal relationship with that person. Even though you might say to yourself, you would say to yourself, unless you're a psychotic, that person is no longer alive. Nonetheless, your emotional constitution, your unconscious life in Freud's terms, is still active as if that person were alive. And the problem with melancholia then is that one continues the relationship as if it were still active. The problem, however, is that that love object is simply a figment of your imagination. It's no longer a live relationship. So if you didn't see the comparison with Be Right Back immediately with Ovid, where I think it's quite clear, where Martha is, in a sense, creating a statue of her dead husband in Robot Ash. In this instance, Melancholia, what has she done? She hasn't done the work of mourning, not to blame her, of course, but she hasn't done the work of mourning. Instead, she's taken that relationship and she's internalized it. She's living as if Ash is still alive. And the ingenuity of this episode has many brilliant features in my mind, but I think the chief ingenious feature of this episode is that it takes that Freudian explanation, namely the external love object is withdrawn into the self, which is very hard to describe because once you get into the domain of the soul, you're dealing in metaphor. What happens at Be Right Back is we have an external object, namely this robot. But what is that robot but the projection of her internal image? And I think that's what's going on in the Ovid story as well. Ovid's got his ideal, Pygmalion in Ovid has got his ideal woman. That statue is, although external, a handy way to talk about what's actually going on in Pygmalion's soul. It's a projection of the internal into the external world. Now, Sartre finally describes for us a paradox of love, namely that we seek the love of someone who freely gives it to us. We don't want to be loved by a statue or a robot or someone who is being controlled by some deterministic process. We want a independent, free person to give us their love freely. And yet, that makes us anxious because the moment we recognize that we're getting that love as a free gift and not as a deterministic process, the possibility opens up that they might revoke the gift, that they might wake up the next day and no longer love us, or love us in a different way that no longer satisfies us, or whatever. Freedom makes us anxious. And so there's a dialectic, if you will, a process in a love relationship where we want the person, the beloved, to be free, but we also want to control the freedom, which is to say, not allow them freedom, that they not be free. And that paradox is at the heart of every love relationship, that each lover is both augmenting the freedom of the other because that's what he wants, but at the same time suppressing the freedom because that's also what he wants. And to just invoke one final name, Sartre is deliberately drawing upon Hegel in that part of his book, Being in Nothingness, because Hegel, in the master-slave dialectic, which I describe in an earlier monologue, Setting Up 15 Million Merits, Hegel thinks that all people desire recognition, and that when two abstract people that he describes meet each other and come into a conflict in their pursuit of mutual recognition, one will prize his life more than he desires recognition, and he will submit to the other who prizes the recognition more than his own life. The former will become a slave, the latter will become a master. The master is a master over his nature to the extent that he can control his desire to live and put his desire for recognition above that primitive need to survive. The slave, by contrast, is determined by his need to survive and is not able to choose and enact his seeking recognition. So we get a master and a slave, but remember, they began in that relationship seeking recognition. The slave obviously is not going to get recognition because he's lost his dignity by preferring his life over his desire for recognition. The master, you'd think, is the winner in that situation, but Hegel shows us that what the master wants is recognition from someone whom he respects. But he doesn't respect the slave because the slave has shown that he's not worthy of recognition. So the master is also a loser in that situation. And Hegel goes on to describe a dialectic, a process by which the slave eventually becomes equal, if not superior, to the master. And that's too complicated to get into now. But you can see, I hope, in that relationship that what the master wants is recognition, but to get it, he enslaves somebody else, but then he doesn't get the very thing that he's seeking. What Sartre has done is taken that abstract, aggressive, conflictual model that in Hegel is actually a battle. Sartre has made it prosaic. Sartre has described the master-slave relationship in the terms of a love relationship, where what we all want is the recognition of someone whom we can respect. And so what we want is somebody who gives it to us because they're free. We can respect that. But in order to be sure that we're getting it, we want to determine that they do so, and that's the enslavement. So Sartre perhaps cynically thinks that every relationship has that kind of sadomasochistic element to it. Each lover is trying to enslave the other, even though that's going to frustrate ultimately his own goals. Okay, so at the last episode, the one about Sartre, I concluded for about 10 or 15 minutes with an attempt to synthesize all of those theories. I'm not going to do that now because I'll be taking up time away from the dialogue that I'm very eager to have with, as I mentioned, Simon DeDeo, who earned his PhD in astrophysics at Princeton University, but has not continued in that field, at least not as an official professor. I don't want to underestimate him. I suspect that there are still ways in which he's doing astrophysics because his mind is so broad and covers so many things in his research. He is officially, though, a professor of social and decision sciences at Carnegie Mellon University. He's in that department, social and decision science, as well as external faculty at the Santa Fe Institute. And I'm tempted to describe his particular position in his department at Carnegie Mellon and to summarize his research, but I know I would fail because, as I said, it covers so many disparate areas, but it's unified by Simon's particular vision. So I'm going to invite him to tell me, first of all, generally, what happens in the Department of Social and Decision Sciences.
Thanks so much, Patrick. We have a lot of fun. CMU is a tech school. We have a lot of freedom to cross disciplinary boundaries. That's been the secret for the university for many, many years. One of the icons for us is a man called Herbert Simon, who was PhD in political science, won the Nobel Prize in economics, did foundational work in artificial intelligence. If we have a guiding star, it's that kind of mind, that way of looking at the world. to see the human in the artificial and the artificial in the human. One of Herb's great books is called Sciences of the Artificial. But the word artificial there includes what we might think of as organically evolved systems like a corporation, a society, as well as the more explicitly engineered things that we associate with contemporary artificial intelligence. So Simon Newell Hall at CMU is where we put the computer scientists, but actually Herb is somebody that we in the social sciences also take up as well. So we get to do, we do not have disciplinary anxiety, and that gives us a lot of freedom. The places I've been fortunate to work have that. And the other place, of course, is the Santa Fe Institute, which is where I built my career after leaving astronomy for the astrophysicists. We run a group called the Lab for Social Minds. So Lab for Social Minds is basically an excuse for us to hire and work with some of the most interesting young or early career scholars that we have. And so we get to do basically anything we want. Very early on, when we started putting that together, we realized that the data science era was coming. We had many different words for it, many different terms. But a lot of what we do right now is a combination of what you might think of as psychology, cognitive science on the one hand, and large-scale pattern recognition, leveraging the powers of the contemporary machine learning moment to do that, to ask those kinds of questions on scales that we haven't been able to ask them before. In thinking of the particular episode that we're talking about today, one thing we'll do, and this is something we did in a project led by a computer scientist, Alexander Barron, who was a PhD at Indiana. Jenny was a political theorist, or is now a political theorist at Oxford. And then Rebecca Spang, who is a historian of the French Revolution at Indiana. And in that case, we took all of the speeches that were made in the National Constituent Assembly in 1789 during the French Revolution. We had the full text of them because it turned out people wrote them down, and then Stanford digitized them, and we had to fix that. But anyway, we took all those speeches and tried to reconstruct essentially, and I think my colleagues would battle me on this one, but you might say we were doing to Robespierre what Martha did to Ash, which was take the records that they had left us, take their speeches, their tweets, and try to reconstruct the cognitive experience of those participants. To do that, obviously, we make a lot of approximations, you might say, but we have underneath it some stories about the way the human mind works, and in particular, in that study we did. We were thinking a great deal about the ways in which people created patterns in the world around them, broke them, preserved them. When they were broken, paid attention, maybe rejected it. So the kind of reconstruction that we do is somewhere in between, let's say, a computer science project and a psychological project.
So if I may, just on that particular project, that sounds to me so far what any historian would do, namely go through the archive, get to the original sources, and try and reconstruct what people were up to in the French Assembly. What's particular to your work there?
This is wonderful, and this is a question that comes up for us because Rebecca is a historian who works in the historical mode, hermeneutic, interpretive. In our case, and this is maybe a little of my physicist side coming out, what we were pushing towards was the idea of building a mathematical representation of the ideas underlying those discussions. So given only the text, given only what people are saying, and in fact, with no notion, a purely syntactical view of this. So when Robespierre says, I don't know, liberty, who knows what that means? But simply looking at how they deploy those terms, how those terms co-occur. So when you say liberty, you always say brotherhood, let's say. can you actually reverse engineer an underlying conceptual map of what's happening in that scene?
If I
Please.
may, this is probably too simplistic, but I want to fasten on what you said about syntax. Would you say that the classical historian looks at semantics, namely, what is the meaning of these words, and the hermeneutic enterprise of trying to see how these meanings all fit together to rebuild that person's mind, what their metaphors were, what was their cognitive architecture? Whereas for you, using data science, it's syntactical. That is, you pull away from meaning altogether and just say what's going on between these various variables. They don't even have to have a meaning.
I think that's right. It's a bold stance to take. The idea that you could get anywhere in, let's say the study of the French Revolution, that you could get anywhere by looking just at these words as noises of particular tones and asking, basically trying to figure out, okay, what's the musicology of these sounds? To treat these words as if they were simply signals, as opposed to meaning-laden objects with a history and a genealogy. That's the challenge. We've done recent work actually putting people in a laboratory. So this is Sabina Sloman's work. We took some of these ideas and tried to apply them to the contemporary moment. So if I say illegal, or if I say undocumented, right? Which party am I? That's an easy pairing. We know that those two tones, where, under some dictionary set of definitions, right, they're identical or at least interchangeable, have different emotional weights, different histories, different contexts. And so out of that, you can start to discover, okay, how does the party system work today? The French Revolution is amazing because they're kind of doing this for the first time. As Americans, we love the founding fathers, right? There were 50 of them. The French Revolution, even in that assembly, there are thousands of people in that room. It's totally different scale, 20, 40, 50 times larger, even among the elites. What we can see in that archive is the nicest photographs is maybe the right way to put it. We don't see what Robespierre's doing in the evenings. We don't see the backroom deals. In fact, we could see some of the signals of the backroom deals there. But we're dealing with essentially a gigantic collection of photographs that people took of each other, except of course they're transcripts taken by journalists, reconstructed. Viewing this almost as if we were historians, perhaps, but historians from Mars, anthropologists from a different galaxy. And all we know is that these people are attempting to communicate. They're obviously engaged in some very Hegelian battle for recognition. My pattern, your pattern. I'll give you my pattern. No, I rejected that sort of thing. But
could the same model be used to describe, say, two ant colonies that are clashing somewhere in the rainforest? Would you, instead of liberty and brotherhood, it's a particular chemical signal that this one ant sends and another chemical signal that this other ant sends? And this is what I'm really just pushing this idea of syntax, that the meaning doesn't matter. It's just about the interactions among all these variables.
So Santa Fe Institute, Melanie Moses, great scientist, does a lot of work on ant colonies. We use the phrase stigmergy. I can think with you in the same way ants can navigate with simple chemical signals, right? An ant colony is able to solve very hard information processing problems, in part by using a very simple set of heuristics. In the same way, I think Herb Simon would say organizations, when they function well, do this. They're smarter than the creatures that inhabit them. One way to think about this is maybe, we do meaning-laden things all day, right? Our lives have valences, have significances to us. But very often we're part of systems, or part of organizations, part of nations, where actually, you know what? It doesn't really matter. Like, I'm glad you have all this qualia. I'm glad you have a genealogy and a history. But in fact, really, all it really matters is, do you have $5 in your wallet to buy a cup of coffee? That's the signal that we need to keep things going. And so part of this is maybe trying to figure out what aspects of the syntax are making things happen in the world, and what other aspects are sort of epiphenomena or sort of spandrels, as Stephen Jay Gould might say, nice little spaces for us to actually live our lives.
Okay, so let's tie it into the episode then.
Mm-hmm.
And you did that just for a moment a little bit earlier,
Mm-hmm.
that this program that produces Robot Ash, eventually there's Robot Ash, the embodied robot, as we typically say, but there's this intermediate stage where it's just an email, namely this quote Ash replies to Martha's invitation to talk. And that algorithm has simply combed through all of Ash's, at that point, public social media accounts, not the private messages, not the private emails, rather in the way that you and your colleagues have combed through, using data science, the public records of the National Assembly. As you say, you don't know what's actually going on in the evening. You don't know about the backroom deals. You don't know what they were thinking. And the pretense is that it's going to give you Ash. Now, one way of simplifying the drama of this episode is that she falls into that trap of acting, believing, feeling as if this is Ash. And I'm tempted to return to the Solomon and the Freud, but we can do that eventually. But just for now, she falls into that trap. And then eventually she pulls herself out because she realizes in this very stark way, you are not Ash. So with that lesson, and you might question whether that's a lesson of the episode or not, do you ever wonder in your work that you're missing something? Namely, you're missing the real Ash.
Well, absolutely, right? It is perfectly possible to build robot Robespierre at this point, to train on his spoken text, to train on French as it was spoke at the time, and to produce some kind of machine that will respond to your questions as if it were in fact Robespierre.
Yeah.
So you might say we're doing science on that object, right? We pull this kind of creature, the statue we've put together. We're the Pygmalions here, and we're going to put that creature in the lab. And we do that. We have to do that for a couple of reasons. One is Robespierre's dead, like Ash. We can put individuals in the lab. Of course, we can put living human beings and ask them questions. One thing we get with Robo Robespierre that we would not get if we just pulled a guy from the college Democrats, put him in the lab and asked them questions about politics. The one thing we get with Robespierre is that we get more as well as less, because we get a human being, the record of their behavior at extraordinarily high stakes moments in their lives. The people in that assembly, and of course Robespierre did eventually, are going to die for the things they're saying there. Those tail events, those extreme events in historical time and in individual time, we usually don't have our scientific equipment out at that moment, right? It would be amazing to put people in an fMRI at the most important moments in their lives. You just can't. So we are certainly missing things with Robespierre, and we should definitely, let's talk about what we're missing.
Yeah.
I will make the pitch, right, that this is we find ourselves in this situation always, even in our own lives, right? We go back to our diaries to look at our lives at a certain critical point in time. All we have is the diary. Who is that person writing that? All we have is their words. And so we may be literary critics about it. We may be computer scientists about it, but we're always in this kind of explanatory inferential process.
Yes.
Who is that guy? If a relationship ends, we might go back. I mean, I recommend not doing this, right? But you might go back and look at the emails, look at the Facebook posts or the tweets or whatever, and try to figure out who was that person.
Yeah.
At that point, you're dealing with a robot.
Yeah, right. The difference, perhaps, would be the difference between what you mentioned earlier, syntax and semantics. That I took you to be saying, yep, we're just doing syntax. We're not doing semantics. Whereas when you go back through the emails, at least as an amateur, but I would think also as a literary critic. It's semantics that's your primary concern. And I can see the advantages of each, but if you're certainly leaving out semantics, you're leaving out the meaning.
Well, one way to think about what we're doing, and this would not oppose our work to traditional historical inquiry, but rather to see them as two forms of the same task,
Yes.
Is to say that we're paying attention. And I think fundamentally in scholarship and science, our goal or our job is to pay attention to things. And paying attention might involve close reading. But it also may be a more scientific or quantitative form of paying attention. So in that sense, I would say, it's not syntax versus semantics, but it's two different forms of syntax.
Okay.
We can see things when we pay attention statistically that we can't see when we pay attention as close readers, for example. Yes.
I see. So you would question, I think, what I suspected was too simple from the beginning, the straightforward distinction between syntax and semantics. That what is it when you investigate semantics? You're doing syntax, just you don't recognize that's what you're doing, and you're not doing it with the scope that data science gives you.
Yeah, if you look at how, when scientists, try to talk about what semantics is, you might say it's, for them, semantics is syntax on a larger scale, right? The meaning of a word may be its relationship to other forms of human endeavor. Teleosemantics is a great example of how they cash this out. There's nothing mysterious about it, right? Yeah. I'm not a dualist on this stuff, right? I'm a monist. Mm-hmm. So everything's syntax and everything's semantics simultaneously. I don't think that distinction is useful on a philosophical scale. Extraordinarily useful, of course, in day-to-day practice.
Right.
It is definitely the case that, when Alexander ran the French Revolution, in one sense you might say he decomposed it into a form of music with 100 different notes.
Okay.
And let's see how those notes compose. But one could do the same thing on a much larger scale, and all of a sudden these notes are really words again. They take on the function for us that they ought to.
Okay, so let's bring it again back to the episode, and I'll ask you a question that I tried to answer in some of the monologues, and I want to hear your answer, certainly before I repeat mine. What do you think disenchants Martha with Robot Ash? As I described earlier, she falls into a trap, but let's be neutral. Let's not call it a trap. She falls in love again with Ash, acts as if he's still alive, and then at a certain moment, and I think it's really climaxes when she asks him to jump off the cliff, and then she screams into the void, and we can talk about the details of that encounter, but that's certainly the final break. What is it that she has learned? Why is she disenchanted?
You have a machine that has produced some kind of simulation of Ash.
Yes.
And you can think of that machine as encoding in itself a story about who this person is. Mm-hmm. And that story is, in many ways, extraordinarily rich. It's based on a cache of data that's much larger than Martha could have ever absorbed or remembered. We often say this when we've done these studies. No one could read all the text that goes into that model. It's incomprehensible to humans. So in one sense, this machine has a model or a simulation or a story about who this person is. And it's extraordinarily satisfying for Martha up to a certain point. And the point at which it becomes unsatisfying is when the story that machine has about Ash is different from the story that Martha has about Ash. You have two stories at this point. One story expressed implicitly as 15 billion neural network weights. And then you have a human story that Martha tells. And of course, we tell stories about each other all the time. So let me give you a somewhat radical answer here, which is that Martha is disenchanted by Ash, in one sense, in the same way that any two people can become disenchanted by each other. There is a story I have, let's say, about a friend, at some point in time, I might come up to the limits of that story and my friend disappoints me. I think that one way to understand that show is, in fact, to put the AI to the side for a little bit. We'll come back to it, right? Mm-hmm. But Ash is kind of a disappointing boyfriend. He's kind of a wimp. Like, jump off of a cliff. Fuck you. No, right? Excuse me. So in one sense, this is just a normal love story. It's the normal story of a relationship ending. Now, the Black Mirror twist, which is sort of fun, of course, is that the story about Ash, the actual story about Ash now is Robot Ash. Robot Ash's story, the underlying set of things that make Ash who he is, was constructed by a machine. It wasn't evolved out of Ash's childhood, but now there's a reconstruction here. Robot Ash's reconstruction of Ash's original story matches pretty well, right? Again, she's completely convinced. It's a little uncanny. There's some of that, but by and large, the robot Ash is able to successfully extrapolate Ash pretty far. Just in the same sense that, I can build a model of the stock market and lo and behold, the market moves and my model moves. And I have some good story about what's going on. At some point, however, Martha discovers that the extrapolation of the robot Ash story is no longer satisfying to her. It is, in fact, somehow something's wrong about it. Now, the way she expresses it in the show is real Ash would never have done that. But another way to say that is my fantasy about who Ash was would never have done that. But you know what? Like, she doesn't really know Ash either. I mean, who knows anybody truly, right? But like, she doesn't know he likes the Bee Gees.
Right.
So one way to spin this, one way to say this is actually, this happens all the time. It's brought to the fore here because the difference is so extreme. And in fact, probably what really brings it to the fore is not when she says real Ash would never have done that, because, that's sort of like the man I married would never have done that, right? That's something that people say. The person I fell in love with would never have done that. What's funny is maybe the robot's like, let me, this is a consumer service product. Let me work this out for you. Let's solve this, which is, of course, nobody wants to marry a slave, right? Nobody wants to marry the object that is going to be whoever you want.
Well, that's what I take, and I don't want to interrupt your train of thought, but I'll just use that as an opportunity to say that's why I think this is different, very, very different from a typical breakup. I'm fascinated by that interpretation. I don't buy it, but I want to explore it, and that's why I'm hesitant to interrupt you. But you put it in terms of slavery. That's why I brought the Hegel to bear on this episode, and that's underwriting the Sartre. That's why I brought the Sartre to bear on this episode, that she wants this robot to be just like Ash, namely determined to fulfill her fantasies. But, and that's what it does for a while, and that's what I describe as her falling into the trap. But then she gets out of the trap, or she's disenchanted, because there's that other side of the paradox of love that Sartre describes. She doesn't want the love of a slave. She doesn't want a determined beloved. She wants the love to be freely given. And no matter how good Robot Ash is at simulating dead Ash, he can never be free. He will always be determined.
Determined by, let's, just to be the kind of nerdy scientist here, right? Determined by an account of a man reconstructed from his social media posts and his private emails.
That's right.
Right. There is some creature there, right? There is some model, at least, of a person. The difference between a person and a model of a person is a difficult one to tease apart, in part because who I am is in part the model I've constructed. I create myself. That only makes sense if there is some activity, there's some statue that's standing there. I would resist a little bit. One way to read this episode is this is a story about how corporations can never truly satisfy us, right? They can't actually be our friends because fundamentally we are consumers and they are producing a product, and they, in the end, have to do what we say. The Ash robot is the sense I get from maybe you disagree, the sense I get from that story is like, look, this is a consumer product, right? So at every point in time, Ash, the model Ash, is indeed designed to satisfy her. But that doesn't have to be the case. In fact, most of the robots we build today are extraordinarily dangerous because we don't know how to do it right. One of the fun things that you learn if you work with people who work with robots is industrial robots. You can't have people anywhere near them because they're extraordinarily strong objects, and you have to separate robots from people because they just don't know if they're going to break your head by moving. They have no sense of this, right? So, our robots are insufficiently servile, right? Do not go on the floor where the robots are working. They don't know how. They're bad slaves. Let's put it that way. And so, to me, that the aspect there where Ash is like robot Ash says, well, I would love to satisfy you by being disobedient, this sort of thing. To me, partly this is sort of the dissatisfactions of a certain kind of consumer approach to relationships, consumer approach to other relations, to ways to be with others. So, and I wouldn't say it's fundamentally located in Ash being a simulation or robot Ash being a model. I would say we are all models, right? At least the people we are with others is in part a model that we have partly conscious, but not entirely conscious control over.
I think I would agree with that. I have to scrutinize it, but just going with it for the moment.
Thanks. Yeah.
If two people are in love, yes, they're each presenting to each other a model of themselves. I take that to be what you're saying. And so let's just say A and B. B's presenting a model, namely, this is my best self, and I'm offering it to you because I want you to love me. And A wants that best self. Those are the things that B showed on the first date. Those are the things that A fell in love with, and B knows this, and so on. In other words, B's going to try and keep that model going. That's the kind of determination. That's the algorithm. But, and this is the Sartrean point, A also wants B not to be a model. A simultaneously wants B to give the model to fulfill the fantasy, but also don't fulfill the fantasy because you're free. And if you just fulfill the fantasy, you're not doing it freely. And that's the paradox.
This is great, right? So let me just try to sort of distinguish two things here, right? There is the model that we present, right? So I have some sense of who I am as a person, and maybe that meets certain criteria or not. I try to communicate that in my actions. My actions are not entirely within my control, or at least they're not entirely. I cannot force my actions to be determined by the model I have of myself, right? Who I am is larger than whatever model I try to project. And part of the fun of coming to know somebody is seeing the relationship between who they want to be and who they think they are and who they actually are. And what if I think we love is the I think both the competition between those two things, but coming to know that larger thing. We build an explanation of another person that's based in part upon what they say about themselves and what they attempt to communicate about themselves, but also something more. So it's that thing that we have a relationship with. Now, that thing is that thing more or less free than a constructed theory of who I am? It's certainly less in my control.
By that thing, do you mean... So let me just step back for the moment. We've got two things going on here. One is the model I present to you, and then the other, I think this is what you're referring to, is that thing. That is the model of who I actually am.
It's one way we talk about this in some research we're doing on this, right, is we build explanations about the world. We try to explain the world. And as explanations get bigger and richer, they turn into models. So if I try to explain why you did something, maybe at the surface I'll be like, oh, he's angry. But the more I come to know you, my explanation starts to fit into a larger story about who Patrick is. That explanation is really a huge network of them, is, I would say, that thing, right? the longer I come to know you, the richer those explanations get.
Right.
The more you surprise me.
Right.
The more your actions, and this goes back to an earlier topic, the more your actions have meaning for me.
Yeah.
They have meaning in part because I can explain them, and I explain them by reference to some kind of idea of who you are.
Well, now I can see why you might think that the whole AI part of this episode is really not relevant, or you can put it to the side, because the data science will give you a better explanation of who someone really is, because it's going to be able to encompass an infinite amount of data, or at least a very large number of data, much larger than any single person can incorporate.
So that's fantastic, Patrick. And so a big problem we have right now with AI is that it's really good at prediction and it's really bad at explanation. AI would be really good at predicting where you're going to go tomorrow, much better than I could, but it will be very bad at explaining it. So I am less accurate about you, but I'm more explanatory. I myself am much less accurate. I would be unable to imitate your email style. A computer could very easily, but I can explain your emails in a way a machine can't. And that is, I think, the real challenge of AI at this point is, well, first of all, do these machines have an explanation at all?
That's right.
Or do they just have a gigantic lookup table, roughly speaking? And the answer is probably somewhere in between. But do they have an explanation? Step one. And step two is, does that explanation, let's say they did, doesn't mean it's comprehensible to us. So machines may be explaining, but in a way that we can't understand. And one of the challenges we've had recently is trying to get across to computer scientists the importance of this other notion, not just prediction, but also explanation.
Yeah. To put it in the market context that you brought up, which I wasn't anticipating at all, and I find very interesting. Someone said to me once that Amazon knows my preferences better than I do, because it makes suggestions about what I might want to buy. And then sometimes I realize, wow, I would really like to have that. It never occurred to me to buy that. So there's a model I have of my desires and preferences. That's relatively simple, let's say. And then there's this deeper, accessible to data science model, if you like, of who I am. That's what Amazon is getting from its vast array of data about what I've actually bought and what I've searched for and so on. And it knows me better than I know myself. And it can do that. So it can do that very well. But it can't when we ask it, well, but why does Patrick want to buy that baseball glove?
I would say machines are really good at paying attention. They don't get tired, right? They are, they are superhuman. If we were a different kind of being, and I'd be like, wow, Patrick, I'm really surprised you bought that book. And you're like, you haven't been paying attention to me, dude. Of course I bought that book because, 7 months ago, my cursor hesitated on clicking between these two, which, right? Yeah. So in one sense, machines are amazing. They pay attention in ways that we are unable to. And again, this is part of the power of data science, why there's great scientific value in it. But they're terrible at the explanation making part.
Yeah.
And one reason they're terrible at it is, of course, explanations don't usually make you money, right? I don't care why the market went up. I just need to know when it's going up. And if you can do it better than someone else, fine. Partly explanations are not useful. The other thing is we still don't really know what an explanation is.
It's also, I love that point about how it doesn't make you money. And that provoked in me the thought that it might be integral to the scientific method. So Newton famously said, hypotheses non fingo. I don't give explanations. I just describe the laws. And the laws, what are the job of the laws? To predict. But why do we have these laws? That's not what I do.
Well, I mean, these are big questions in philosophy of science, right? And they're sort of above my pay grade. It's sort of psychoanalyzing yourself, right? You're not meant to do it. But I noticed this perhaps because we've written papers in probably half dozen disciplines at this point. And you realize that, every scientific discipline explains differently. One discipline loves causality. Another discipline loves mathematical formalism. For a physicist, you've explained something if you show how it's the consequence of a unexpected mathematical relationship. For a biologist, it's like, well, that's cute, but you haven't explained it until you've put it into a causal framework or you've put it into an evolutionary framework. So explanation is this, it's, what these folks are doing is, it's mysterious. It's certainly the case, though, that being good at explanation has been really important. So, if I'm trying to sell why I care about explanation to somebody who needs to make money, the answer is like, well, there's something mysterious about it, because the people who were really good at prediction were also really good at explaining. Newton, kind of a kooky example, because of course he did try to explain things. Not a Newton scholar though, right? So I'm on a limb here, right? But maybe to take a writer that we know a little better, William Whewell, philosopher of science, in the 19th century, spent a lot of time trying to figure out what is it about good science, not demarcation good versus bad, but like what makes a theory great. And one way he says this, at least we claim he does this is work led by Zachary Woltowicz, is great science co-explains. It doesn't just predict stuff in the domain it was designed for, but it actually implies things in a totally different world that, lo and behold, you go look and there you find it. And I'm under describing Whewell's point. This is a very subtle one, but I think implicit in how scientists have been doing things is there are these implicit theories of when something has been explained and not. We think about this with Ash, right? Robot Ash is really highly predictive of regular Ash in normal contexts. He is, he's making the same kinds of jokes. Like very early on, this is creepy, right?
I'm the late Abraham Lincoln, silly.
Yeah, exactly. It's like he's great in sample or in domain prediction. But when she takes Robot Ash out, and this is maybe where the AI now becomes important again, when she puts the AI in a situation that real Ash had never experienced, totally out of domain, tells him to jump off a cliff, literally, though, like literally kill yourself. The AI has no predictive power. It's failing now, right? The human Ash, it's an open question what the human Ash would have done. The human Ash may have actually said, look, well, this is so out of domain, I'm just going to crack mentally. I'm going to have a literal mental breakdown. And I don't know, like if, your girlfriend, walks you to the cliff and tells you to go literally jump off a cliff and you're like, that's not funny. And she's like, no, I mean it. Yeah. I think some people would actually have a breakdown, right?
Sure. Some people would jump. Some people would break up.
Some people, well, and so, the question is like, you put a model, one way to think of it, you put a model under that level of stress, what happens? So, the robot Ash fails a certain kind of stress test that human Ash may or may not have passed.
Yes. But that gets at, I think, this fundamental, perhaps, disagreement that we're having, that you're looking at the failure of the AI to do what the real person would have done, at least in this scenario. But what if we built a better AI that would have 100% predictive power? That makes it sound like, well, then if she breaks up with him the way she does in this episode, well, that's just an accelerated version of what happens in everyday life. Whereas I'm coming at it by saying, even with the 100% predictive power, there's still something missing. And we've been circling around that by talking about explanation. I have something I still want to say about that might enrich the discussion. But even there, I think it goes deeper than explanation. I'll allow you to reply, then I want to come back with the thing I want to say earlier.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things that's coming up for us here, right, is, and this is a topic that we both, I'm sure, have many opinions on, is the question of freedom of will.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's what it gets to, I think.
If the machine is, simply running a model of Ash, then the model is determined in some way. Right. And so therefore there is sort of nothing, there is no choice here, right? That the parameters have been set up early, and he's simply playing out whatever the machine would have done. I might dodge that question a little bit and talk about, okay, here's an obvious case where Ash would not have freedom of will, where literally that model was set up early on, and there was no, for example, learning that was possible. It was simply a stimulus response object, right? You say, given this situation, what would you do? The model predicts something. There seems there to be not really a level of freedom that the machine has. But at some point in time, an explanation, let's say that the model of Ash reaches the level of an explanation of Ash. At some point, the explanation gains a human autonomy, gains a level of freedom.
Okay, well, and I think that is the crux. Let me now introduce the thing I want to say earlier, but it's just as relevant to this. It's a book by Richard Moran called Authority and Estrangement. And it's been 10 years since I've read it, but here's the point from it that I remember. He says, imagine, you're getting married and you are waiting for the I do from the other at the altar. This applies to any promise, and I'm probably over dramatizing it by giving it this.
No, it's good. I'm in.
It's what happens
it's
next?
like 2 grants there. I see the movie.
No, you get left at the altar and you run out of the church.
Yeah.
There's a big difference between someone saying, I predict that I will love you for the rest of our lives, and someone saying, I will love you for the rest of our lives. Now, that's the stark contrast. Explanation, I think, is an intermediate case, but it's still on the side of prediction, because you would be dissatisfied if the person says, I predict that I will love you for the rest of my life. And then you say, well, what do you mean you predict? How do you even know that? And then she says, well, here's the explanation. And let's say it's 100% accurate. Let's say it's based on all the best data science, even better than we have right now, better than we can imagine. Models that are 100% predictive based on an explanation of the neurochemistry of the bride-to-be. You still want something more at the altar, namely you want the person to commit. You're not asking them to predict what they'll do. You're not asking them to base their prediction on a 100% explanation. You want them to freely commit.
All right, but let me come back and do that, Patrick. So I'm at the altar, right? And I'm with this beautiful lady, right? And it's like, do you love me? Yes. But do you really love me? At some point she might say, why the fuck do you think I'm here, dude? How do you explain the last 7 years of our goddamn relationship that ends like this in this fucking church unless I love you? Like that to me, it's like, let me explain. I'm not gonna, maybe we have to do something legally or whatever in front of our friends. We got to do something, but let me explain to you what's going on. That I think is what we actually want.
Okay, well, I'm not sure I understand it. Let me play the role of the bride-to-be, and you tell me, I'm going to at least play what I think you're saying.
Yeah.
The priest or whoever is asking for my vow, and I say, instead of I will or I do, I say I predict that I will. Do you feel dissatisfied by that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I say, oh, don't be dissatisfied. Here's the explanation that will convince you that my prediction is 100% guaranteed to be accurate. Just like predicting why this coffee cup will fall if I push it off the table. Yeah. Based on all the best science, all the best data you have about me as an individual. Yeah. Do you want anything more than that? I mean, here I'm trying to play now the bride-to-be. I can say, why the fuck do you think I'm here? It's because we spent 7 years together, and here is my model, and it explains, and that's why I predict. What more do you want?
So, I mean, first of all, I'd love to see that explanation, right? Because that explanation could, in fact, be deeply satisfying.
Deeply satisfying?
Deeply satisfying.
Okay.
The difficulty here, and maybe this is what you're trying to get me to see, Patrick, is the relationship to the future, right? I want to understand why this person is next to me right now. In some sense, having the explanation would be wonderful, and hopefully it would be a good explanation, meaning not just one that I understand, but also one that was hopefully satisfying to me. Like the explanation was not you're really tall.
Well,
right?
And just to be clear, I have nothing against the explanation. And the example isn't meant to say there's anything bad about explanation. It's just that it's insufficient.
Well, so the question is what happens in the future, right? I think the real question is not, say in front of everybody, you love me, right? I would love, given the choice between somebody saying I love you and somebody explaining why they love me, of course I'd take the second one, right? Because I'm very curious. But second of all,
I thought you were going to say, of course I'd take the first.
Oh, no,
Maybe that shows why we're different.
Well, so I mean, but also because it would tell me a great deal about the person, and I would learn a great deal. And if, I would either get a story from them about who they think they are, who they want to be, which is amazing. Or if there was some crazy fMRI there, whatever, I would learn a great deal about that. It would be an enriching moment. And I think that's what we do when we write love letters, for example. Many love letters do many things, but one of the things they do, I think, is explain ourselves. We explain ourselves to each other. But then the question is, okay, what happens going forward, right? Maybe the right way to say it is, this is why I love you right now. And that explanation is sufficient to describe or to predict everything that's going to happen next. And so maybe what's dissatisfying about the future orientation, about using the explanation in a future orientated sense, is that we want people to be, as creatures that we explain, we want those explanations to be dynamic, growing, and altering. I would love to know who you are right now. And to me, knowing who you are is largely building an explanation of who you are. Think about analysis, psychoanalysis. In some sense, they are providing a new explanation of you to yourself. And funny thing about analysis, thought about this, is that analysis is also paying attention. So in the same way a data science investigation might notice a funny pattern in how you use words, an analyst might do the same thing. Out of that funny pattern might provide an enriching explanation for you. But the idea that that explanation is the final explanation that's very disturbing. And, if somebody really did say, I predict that I will love you forever, and here's the explanation, at that point, it becomes very disturbing.
I agree. And I think that's what Sartre's saying. That would mean the person is determined. And although there's a part of you that has the fantasy that they're determined, because that alleviates the anxiety that they might stop loving you, because it's sure, after all, they're determined, it nonetheless hits the nerve of the other side of the paradox of love, which is you want this love to be freely given, not as a result of an algorithm.
Well, so one of the things about explanations is that, at least as humans, we reflect on them. We're able to reflect on them. And so I think it is actually impossible to have this, you have your bride do this. One of the reasons it's impossible is, let's say that she does indeed provide an explanation to you. The very act of providing that explanation, and in particular, her becoming aware of that explanation, let's say, she may have known it all along, right? But the very particular act of providing that explanation, hopefully, makes that explanation no longer valid. Right. This is, these are, mathematically, this is Gödel's incompleteness there, and this is recursiveness, right?
Yes.
Once the object contains or refers to itself, all of a sudden there are gaps. And this is maybe a chance to talk about briefly my favorite theory of free will, which is by Seth Lloyd. It's a paper of his called A Turing Test for Free Will. No machine, no computer program can predict all of its outputs. So without running the program itself, there's no way for it to say, okay, given these outputs, here's what I predict I will do.
Is this the conclusion of the argument that you're giving me in anticipation, or is this the premise?
This is the conclusion, but so sort of closely related to the set of premises that are obvious, right? It's like, this is not a famous paper. It's lovely. It's a cute little paper, right? But it's the same style of argument that's used in theoretical computer science.
The reason I asked, not to be pedantic, is that seemed false to me. Now, it could be because I don't understand computers well enough, but could you tell me why that's true? And that might be to say, can you give me the argument for that this guy gives?
Oh, sure. These arguments are somewhat unsatisfying, or at least the proofs are somewhat unsatisfying, because they involve feeding the argument to itself. So let's imagine that you could indeed predict everything that you're going to do in every circumstance. So you have some kind of, let's say, little program you run, or a little model of yourself that you run, that, given the situation you're currently in, that will predict what you do next. So now just imagine that the initial conditions, the context you find yourself in, is the context in which what you want to do is run the prediction algorithm and do the opposite.
You don't run the prediction algorithm?
Or you run the prediction algorithm. You say, in this context, run the prediction algorithm on the context. Looks like I'm going to do X, and then do not X.
I guess I'm missing it. I'm sure it's my failure.
It's like so trivial in some sense that it's simply because you yourself have access to the prediction algorithm.
Yes.
Then one thing you can do is run the prediction algorithm on what you're currently in your current context, and then do the opposite of it.
Oh, okay. But that's why I'm confused. You're imagining a human being doing this who has the free choice when they're confronted with those two options.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought we were imagining a machine that doesn't have freedom.
There's no sort of mystical free will you need here. You just need any computer program. There's some function X,
Mm-hmm.
so you can always create another function that runs function X and returns the opposite.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's probably because
It's
not able
gosh,
to
yeah.
follow.
Okay, let's think about that. We can wrap a little bit, Patrick. Maybe edit some stuff out. It's
And I understand what you're saying. I get it in the human case.
Yeah.
Because you run the prediction. Let's say the prediction says I'm going to drink coffee rather than tea.
mm-hmm.
I run it. It says that. And then I realize, hey, I can still choose tea. And I choose tea in order to frustrate the
Mm-hmm.
prediction. That I totally understand.
Mm-hmm.
What I don't understand is how, when you apply that to the machine, you get the same result. Because if the machine applies it to itself and it is a 100% accurate prediction and it predicts coffee, the machine can't say, haha, I'm going to foil you by exercising my free will and choosing tea.
There's maybe a little slippage here in the notion of 100% accurate
Mhm.
prediction.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe one of the issues in this are going back and forth here is we're kind of debating the immovable object, unstoppable force,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So, let us assume there was an algorithm that a machine could run that could predict what it was going to do next, given its input.
Okay.
Then one of the inputs it could receive is the instruction to run the prediction algorithm and then to do the
Yes.
opposite of what that prediction
I see.
algorithm
Okay.
urges it to do.
Okay. I see.
So this is...
But then it should have built that into its prediction.
So let's say...
Well, now we have a liar paradox, because if it predicts it does
Yep.
X, then it's going to do not X, but then it should have predicted not X, but then it'll do X. So we just have the liar paradox. I don't see what's special about this.
There's nothing special about
Okay.
it. The liar paradox is a paradox of self-reference.
Yes.
This statement is a lie. That kind of sentence is possible
Okay.
only when the indexical this can apply to the very sentence in which it appears.
Yes. Okay.
Gödel's insight was to show that any mathematical formalism of sufficient complexity
Yes.
could effectively do that.
Yes.
Alan Turing did the version where the computer is the mathematical process.
Okay.
As long as the system is able to refer to itself,
Yes.
and in particular its internal workings, then you have an unpredictability here.
Okay.
You can predict from the outside. So Seth has a wonderful line on this one, right? Sometimes I go to the restaurant and it's like, well, what do you want? And I'm not sure. Let's see what I order. So that's kind of the thing. Like, the only way to know what I'm going to do is to actually run my program forward.
Mm-hmm.
There's no sort of shorter program that can predict what I'm going to do without actually being the thing that runs whatever software I'm doing. There's no smaller program sitting inside my software that I can run that can do everything my software can. It's another way to think of it.
Uh-huh. And so I see now why I was misunderstanding when I was saying it's 100% accurate prediction, because that's what this is calling into question. You cannot have a 100% accurate prediction when it's a self-referential algorithm.
Right. So this, this kind of, it's called diagonalization in computer science and logic. The idea that, let's say, list all of the programs that, take a certain time to run and, produce a certain set of outputs. There's no set of programs that take a shorter amount of time that can do the same things. If it were possible for a computer to predict what it's going to do without actually doing it, well, hey, I don't need to buy the expensive computer. I'll just buy the prediction algorithm,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mhm.
Like, why bother to get the super fast computer when I can get this smaller computer that can predict what the super fast computer is going to do in any circumstance? So that's another way to
Okay.
see about it. If it were true, if it were possible to have a prediction algorithm running on the computer that could predict everything that computer was going to do,
I see.
well, just throw out the rest of the computer
Mhm.
and just delete all your programs except that one program.
And then you get what was valuable about the
Exactly.
computer.
Then you get what's valuable. So that's maybe a way to kind of drive the intuition that a computer that can predict its own outputs in every situation is
Mhm.
somehow getting something for free.
Yes. Okay.
Now, these are deeply, I am teaching this extraordinarily poorly in an extremely confusing fashion. But the the magic here comes not from assuming some sort of magical free will fluid, but maybe a simpler thing, which is that I have, I think my thoughts go a certain way. I can also think about myself, but through thinking about myself, I predict everything that I'm going to do. If that's the case, then some smaller part of me is equivalent to the whole.
Yes.
I don't actually have to live. I don't actually have to think entirely. All I have to do is do that little sub-thinking part.
Yes.
And then I can get the answer.
Yes. This reminds me of an argument in Plotinus. Well, first of all, in Sextus Empiricus, the ancient skeptic, who thought that thinking about yourself was impossible, because you think of a part of yourself that's doing the thinking. If it's thinking about the rest of you, well, then it's not thinking about itself. It's thinking about something else that you're mistakenly calling yourself.
Yep.
But if it thinks about itself, this little part that we're imagining, it's either the subject or the object of the thought. And if it's the object of the thought, if it's being thought about, there's nothing left for it to do. And so it's not thinking about itself. If it's the subject of the thought, it's doing the thinking, but there's no object for it to be the thinking, or to be the object of the thinking of the subject. So Plotinus thinks he solved this problem. So I'm not presenting it as an absolute problem that has no solution. But if it were a successful problem, and in other words, there were no solution for it, when we think, we would have to choose, are we being the object or are we being the subject? It's a problem of self-referentiality. And that if you're playing the role of subject, you can't simultaneously play the role of object. If you're playing the role of object, you can't simultaneously play the role of subject. It is a good critique of materialist psychologies. This is Plotinus's point. And Sextus Empiricus was responding to the materialist psychologies of the Epicureans and the Stoics, who were not dualists. They were both monists who thought that whatever the mind is, it's something material. Because if the mind is material, the part that's doing the putatively self-referential thinking, that's a piece of matter. Now, what's it thinking about? If it's thinking about the rest of, in our idiom, the brain, then it's not thinking about itself. It's thinking about this thing called the brain that's we're mistakenly confusing with itself. If it's thinking about itself, it has to simultaneously play a role of subject and object. But if it's just a bit of matter, it's not got the complexity that would be needed to play both those roles at the same time. You might think, oh, it is. It's, let's say it's a little part of the brain. Cerebral cortex, that's a big part of the brain. But just imagine a corner of the cerebral cortex which is able to do that. Well, now we've just replicated the problem. If before we had that little corner of the cerebral cortex thinking about the whole brain, and we're willing to dispense with the rest of the brain because that's not itself, it's whatever it is that's doing that thinking, the little corner. Well, now we've just got the same problem when that little corner tries to think about itself. Is it thinking about the entirety of itself? Okay. Well, the thing that's the part of it that's doing the thinking, that's now just a little part of the little part. I'm garbling this, but it seems to me that it's getting through to you.
This is wonderful. I mean, one of the great results, second incompleteness theorem of Gödel, is a mathematical formalism cannot prove its own consistency. You can prove it from the outside, and we get this. We see these kind of recursive moves all over the place. Tarski's theory of truth. True is to be true in some meta language.
Yes.
To me, what's most exciting in 21st century philosophy, I guess, right, is drawing together the kinds of thinking that we did in order to understand mathematical logic, computation, which are fundamentally, all the interesting problems come from these self-reference problems, where the creature that's doing the thinking is reflecting upon itself. The code that is predicting has to predict, in part, the outcome of all the possible things that might happen when it runs its own code. There's nothing wrong about, Microsoft Word building a more efficient version of Microsoft Word that turns out to predict all the things Word would have done. Right? There's nothing wrong with that. What the problem is, what happens when that little object is part of the Microsoft Word system itself.
So if I'll just be repeating, I think, what you're saying, just to make sure I understand. Then I want to compare it to what I try to present extemporaneously from Sextus Empiricus. If you've got a part of Word which is predicting what the rest of Word will do, you don't need the rest of Word. The part is fine. Okay. Similarly with Sextus Empiricus, if you've got a part of yourself that's predicting or understanding the rest of yourself.
Mhm.
You don't need the rest of yourself, because whatever was supposed to be in that is now in the part that's doing the
Mhm.
thinking. All
Mhm.
right. Now, the problem with the mechanistic model, never mind
Mhm.
sexus empiricus for the moment. I'm just trying to get us back eventually to be right back.
Yeah.
The problem with that was what?
The problem with balls. The problem with what was what? Sorry.
We're getting too self-referential.
Yeah.
We were originally looking for freedom, I
Mhm.
think. And
Yeah.
you said, here is somebody's argument for free will.
Yeah.
And it's a recursive argument for free will.
Perfect. Well, let's drive the intuition a little bit with Seth's paper. So Seth Lloyd, I got to advertise, right? Seth, great SFI affiliate as well. We read his paper. I read it with a bunch of philosophers in New Mexico. Here's a really unsatisfying life. The life where you know what you're going to do in every situation,
Mm-hmm.
right? I can predict what's going to happen. I can predict what I'm going to do.
Mm-hmm.
That world is certainly a world, intuitively would say, without free will.
Mm-hmm.
If I can know it, if I can predict it,
Yes.
right? That's a stronger notion of free will, right? But Seth's article goes a long way towards saying at least that is not possible. It is
Okay.
it is at least the case, given the fact that we have sufficient levels of self-reference,
Yes.
it is at least the case that we are unable to predict the outcomes of our own behaviors in every situation.
Okay.
Because under the assumption that we could, right, we would be in the position of predicting what happens in situations where we predict what happens and we do something else.
Yes. And then you have an infinite regress. Is that the problem?
Well, you have they call it a diagonalization argument,
Okay.
in the sense that it's a reductio in some sense.
Is diagonalization referring to, I'm forgetting the name of that argument that gives you
Cantor?
multiple orders of infinity?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. There's exactly.
Okay.
You assume that you have enumerated all the possibilities and show that
There's
enumeration
another
cannot
one.
be complete.
Yes.
I'm using the term pretty loosely here.
Yeah,
Just
okay.
this is when
Okay.
I hang out with people who know more about this than I
Okay.
do. That's how
But
they
for our
talk.
purposes, then an infinite regress argument.
It's an infinite regress. Yeah.
That, by
or-
the way, is the sextus argument, that
Mhm.
self-knowledge would require an infinite regress of part within part within part within part. And
Mhm.
if you never get the part knowing itself, you never get self-knowledge.
I think that's a fair way to say it. And the infinite regress in Gödel, he says, look, there are things you can't prove in mathematics. Okay, fine. You can always add them in as axioms, but every time you add in a new axiom, you have another thing you can't prove. So you
Okay.
just keep going. No finite system,
Yes.
right? Now I mentioned at the beginning when we started talking about this, these arguments can be somewhat unsatisfying. And the reason they can be unsatisfying is they seem like these real edge cases, right? Like, okay, yeah, it's true. If I run the prediction algorithm and do that, it's like there's something a little bit like it doesn't quite drive the intuition, right? Reductios often fail to drive intuitions. But one thing that kind of transformed my view of these kinds of arguments is to realize that these kinds of inconsistencies are sitting everywhere. And so self-reference, the problem of self-reference, the paradoxes it leads to appear in really unexpected places as well. So, in the case of Gödel's incompleteness theorems, one place they show up is like, whether or not a certain algebraic equation crosses the x-axis at an integer, like
Right, okay.
what the hell does that have to do with self-reference?
Who cares?
Right?
All right.
It's kind of baked in, right? It's like once you drink, you're done, right? So maybe one thing I'd say is, yeah, these self-referential arguments are more than just little tricks.
Well, tell me whether it applies to the case we were talking about earlier, where your bride-to-be
Mhm.
is at the altar, and when asked to commit, she says, "I predict that I will be faithful to you forever."
So, let's say not only does she predict, but let's say here's my explanation for why it's going to be this way. Now you have two choices at that point. Either your bride-to-be is a sociopath, right? So she has this explanation about who she is and the kind of person she is, and it's a terrific explanation. Fits all the data, has all these great explanatory values we all like, right? It's great. It's, from the point of view of any philosophy of science, this is a wonderful explanation. And she may simply say, that's who I am. And we're just going to roll with that for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing that denies, of course, is the possibility that she herself is able to reflect upon that explanation.
Okay.
If that explanation is now something that's, let's say, in the object position, in the subject object.
Yes.
And so
she's lost her subjectivity.
Wow. Yeah, I guess you could say that. That sounds like these are these high class philosophy outcomes you get.
I'm just guessing.
Yeah,
that's
no,
what we're driving towards.
That she at that point she has a choice either to abandon the possibility of being a subject.
Yes.
Meaning somebody who can reflect upon that explanation.
Yes.
Right. And in as much as she reflects upon that explanation, then it's all over. She doesn't even have to be like, right. I'm going to love you forever because, the way I can explain this, I'm a really deeply good person. Uh-huh. She doesn't have to say now, I'm going to go kill somebody. Right. Yeah. She doesn't, it doesn't require a explicit rejection of the prediction.
Just has to ask, am I really a deeply good person?
But the very aspect of doing that now at least imperils the predictive power of that very explanation.
Right.
So it isn't that she can choose to. This is not some weird, kind of fake Nietzsche thing, right? Where you go kill someone just to prove you're unpredictable or unexplainable, right? But the very fact that she has that explanation, at that point, having had that explanation, well, then she becomes a philosopher, right? And don't marry a philosopher, I guess, because they become unpredictable.
I just want to connect some dots. You called this the possibility of a sociopath. I understand that now to be someone who isn't able to rise above their own thinking to say, might I think otherwise? Someone who sees themselves purely as an object.
Well, sociopathy is fascinating because, and this is a question I have in some of the research we do. So what exactly is going on? What sociopaths often do, at least the kind of charismatic cult leader types, is they're very good at explaining things. They produce wonderful explanations that people find deeply compelling. And so one example of sociopathy I would say is in the online world is red pill. A certain way of approaching or explaining the relationships between the sexes. Sociopaths adopt these kinds of explanations, give them to other people, and essentially make them sufficiently attractive that people adopt them as modes of living.
Yeah, I'm just imagining a male sociopath in this case, and I guess that would fit the red pill scenario you're describing. Yeah. Implants an algorithm into the people, and then they become determined by that algorithm.
Exactly.
He's taking away their freedom.
And usually what's kind of wrapped up in the sociopathy story is, or in those kinds of stories, is that if at any point that explanation starts to fail, it's because you're a loser lobster, you're a beta, whatever it is.
You haven't fully assimilated the explanation.
Exactly. It's like you're not high IQ, whatever and they all sorts of status games involved in that, right? So that's the sociopathy problem. Now I would say why is history not the history of sociopaths? It's because, in fact, once the explanation is present, the system evolves forward unpredictably. So in the end, the explanations have to fail in the same way that, take the nice explanation. Your bride-to-be explains why she knows she's going to love you forever because of all these wonderful features that are totally praiseworthy and delightful. She now becomes unpredictable to you, not because she's going to rebel against that, but simply because that explanation is now part of the object
her character.
World.
Yes,
exactly.
I see.
And so, a philosopher, as opposed to a sociopath, a philosopher is unpredictable in this sense. The explanation, there's no final explanation. In the progress of history, plenty of sociopathic things float around. One of the great examples in the history of philosophy is Otto Weininger, Sex and Character, who was, I would say, he himself is a nut, he killed himself, but great influence on Ludwig Wittgenstein. In fact, you can see his influence on an enormous number of early 20th century intellectuals. What is it? It's a hodgepodge of anti-Semitism. Today we'd call it sexism, misogyny, true genius, Jews or homosexuals or women can't be true geniuses, all this kind of stuff that to us seems really dated. But Wittgenstein is like, oh my God, how do I get out of this? And eventually he comes to the conclusion that Weininger is wrong, but interestingly wrong. The history of thought is not, thank God, the history of Weininger, it's the history of Wittgenstein. But those kind of sociopathic explanations show up from time to time.
And you're right that they're often the shadow of the people we remember as the great thinkers of that period. We don't canonize them, but they were very influential at the time.
Exactly. They produce an explanation for the world that many people find compelling. There's psychoanalytic stuff going on here, right? Sort of internalized anti-Semitism in the case of many intellectuals, internalized homophobia in the case of Wittgenstein. So there's many reasons that this is compelling to him. He grows up and he grows out of it. If you look at sociopaths in this particular, and I should be clear, I'm not using sociopath in some
it's a very
DSM sense,
technical notion. You also have a very technical notion of the philosopher too, because I would have thought the philosopher and the sociopath have a lot more in common.
Oh God, no!
In your view,
no. I mean, this is
by your definitions, they're the opposite.
It's like Socrates versus the sophist, right? These are kind of sort of poles here. But yeah, looking at how sociopathy works and how sociopaths gain the influence they do, they usually gain it over 20-year-olds, right? That age range.
One reason why graduate school is so dangerous.
Well, yeah, exactly. It's a good thing graduate education is such a disaster. Right? But the way in which people get others to adopt explanations, and again, it's they're not quite getting people to run algorithms, but it's pretty close.
Yeah.
You can see some people never grow out of these kinds of explanations.
Right.
Most people do. But if we look, and I guess we're talking a little bit about research here, if you look at how some of these communities work, you usually have a very large population of men between 17 and 23 who are the audience for these explanations, and a group of men in their 40s, 50s who are providing them, small group, who've often been there for many, many years. But explanations, it is possible for me to explain somebody else. It's possible for me to explain many situations. But it is impossible for me to do two things. One is, of course, to explain myself completely, unless I somehow explicitly agree to keep that explanation going. So out of a desire for consistency, let's say. But it's also impossible for a society, if I explain something in society and that explanation becomes known within the society, now all of a sudden we again have this kind of diagonalization, self-prediction problem. The one thing the society can't do at the very minimum is predict the population of people who know that explanation. This is something that comes up in some of the really interesting, this is Bourdieu, right? Looking for reflexive sociology, right? The way, he says this when he starts talking about, let's do a science of science. Let's study science itself. It's look, it's a natural phenomenon. What do you believe in ghosts? Of course, it's normal, right? It's a human thing, right? So let's study it. He says, all right, step one, I'm reading this. Step one, he's like, great. So if this is true, it's gonna work on itself. So in fact, we're gonna do science of science of science. And I'm like, that's so French, but actually it's totally legit, right? It's actually a pretty legit move. It's the most challenging move you can go to. Bourdieu spent a lot of time working on sociology of class, including his own class, sociology of academia. So, that's where I think a lot of the most interesting stuff happens at this point. It's this question of, and maybe we can bring this back to the show itself.
Yes. Well, I was going to return for the moment to the example I mentioned from Richard Moran, Authority and Estrangement. You get it from the title, really, that if somebody accepts an explanation of themselves in the way that you're saying these red-pilled young men accept the explanation of who they are and what gender is and why they're having the troubles that they're having and so on. Right. If they accept that and then live according to that explanation, in Moran's term, they've estranged their freedom. That, I don't know if you put it this way, that important part of growing up is taking authority for your own life. And so it would be one obvious reason why young people would be especially vulnerable to this. That what do you do as a child? Well, you do estrange your authority. You need to. That's the only way you're going to survive. Your parents are making decisions for you because you don't know how to make decisions until you start aging. And then there's a certain point in your life, be different for everybody, where it's time to claim your own authority. But one thing that will involve in the Moran story is that you don't make decisions any longer because that's what you would have predicted that you would do, but rather you make it because of this free commitment.
I think, you're making me think of one aspect of the work we're doing on some of these communities, which is, this is a childlike position to be in. So why does it keep going? Like, why are people still doing it at 21? And one of the things that I notice is that the explanations that are given in these communities are actually pretty Baroque. They're satisfying. at least from the point of view of psychologically satisfying from the point of view of explanatory values. But one thing that struck me looking through this was informally, qualitatively early on, is like, God, like you have to learn like, you know, Bob Triver's theory of group selection. Like this is, you know, they have, you know, I think maybe in some ways deferred the realization that most of us come to when we're children at some point. It's like, okay, yeah, I get it. That's the way it all works. And then step 2 is like, you know what? I'm not the only fool in this room, right? You know, everybody, you know, at some point, my friends also get it. So now all of a sudden we escape from whatever predictive, you know, the explanation starts to fail. There's the kind of Straussian angle, right? There's the esoteric angle, which is like, I know what's going on. And I think Strauss gets it, right? Like the one thing you can't do if you have an explanation that works for everybody and you got to keep it going is don't tell anybody the explanation, right? For Christ's sake.
Well, they'll never tell me. I keep asking them, what is this?
What's the
grand
esoteric
theory?
teaching?
And they won't tell it.
Yeah, no, check your DMs, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's, I mean, we see this, you know, I think when the idea of secret knowledge gets sophisticated enough, I think people start to realize that if everybody knows this, right? Once we all read The Prince, and then, okay, fine, we read the secret of the Prince, right? We can decrypt it. The Prince no longer works. It you know, it's a great intellectual moment, but as an explanation for what's happening now, no, right? You know, flip side is someone like Hobbes, right? So Hobbes tells a story about the world. The very act of making that story known means that we don't actually have to do that, right? Okay. That we don't actually need to run this crazy, you know, whatever brinksmanship game that he says is necessary.
Yeah. I don't want to beat the dead horse, but I hear in that an echo of what I was trying to say earlier, which is that when you become aware of your algorithm or your explanation or whatever it is that's doing the predictive power, you gain a freedom over it that you didn't have before, or at least that you didn't know that you had before. You actually had it all along, but that you weren't able to claim it. You weren't able, in Moran's terms, you weren't able to claim your own authority. And that we can do that, but the AI, back to the episode, that's what Ash can't do.
So, yeah. Right. So,
and by Ash, I meant robot.
Robot Ash, exactly. Is Ash incapable of reflecting upon who he is? Is Robot Ash incapable of reflecting upon who he is? And that's perhaps the question here.
Yeah.
Right. You know, if Robot Ash goes into psychoanalysis, what happens? Right. You know, psychoanalysis as a potential source of freedom. Right. The idea of psychoanalysis is like, look, I'm going to explain you. And so, you know, people might say, oh my God, that's awful. Like, it's just about my mother. Like, you've taken away all my freedom. No, actually, right? Like, the reflective step here is now that you have this, you have new powers, right? You can reflect upon this. You can do things with it. You know, it's no longer repressed, right? It's no longer part of the hidden operating system. It's now surfaced, right? So you now have new powers to actually become less predictable rather than more. You stop repeating. There's no repetition.
Yeah, if I may, just to connect it up with the material I mentioned from the monologues, that's what Freud thinks psychoanalysis can do to transform you from a melancholic to a mourner. You have this unconscious operating system, you called it, this internal object that you're using to keep alive the fantasy that the person still exists. When you bring it to consciousness, instead of repeating, which is the notion of transference, instead of continuing to fall in love with a series of people who help you keep alive the fantasy that internal object is in fact external still. You stop doing that because you become aware of that internal operating system and realize how frustrating it is to you. And you can start mourning, which is to say, withdrawing the libido from the object instead of pulling the object into your imagination. Again, quasi-dynamic, quasi-electronic Freudian notion for a phenomenon I think is more simply and accurately described by Solomon as you lived in a certain emotional world constituted by all sets of judgments that he calls your surreality. One of those judgments was, this person is still alive. You start to teach yourself in the hard way, that is the working through in that essay, Repeating, Remembering, and Working Through by Freud. You work through, you transform the judgments of this person is still alive to this person is dead. Something that's very easy to do rationally and consciously. The next day, you know the person's dead. But the hard work is the emotional, deep inertia of your soul is this person is still alive, and you have to daily practice this person is dead.
I'm struck. There's a book that was really influential for me in terms of thinking about melancholia and depression, is Kristave's Black Sun.
Yes, tell me.
And so Black Sun is, I mean, it's obviously it's a deep book, it's a complicated book. She talks in terms of loss and depression as being unable to come to terms with loss. What one does, the sort of mature position, is realize that loss is part of language itself, of even being able to express means the separation of subject and object, means that there is some thing that refers to some other thing that's not there.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to do that is, I would say, maybe she does, a tragic position in some sense. That, we can actually reflect upon things. Reflect meaning simply refer to things, use them as part of a circulating system of things that we talk about. Not quite syntax, not quite semantics, right?
Yeah, right.
That, the being able to put something that was subject into object, perhaps is maybe the right way to say this. You have some aspect of yourself that is repeating something, let's say. You now have to bring that into the object position. It now becomes something that you can reflect on. And in being able to reflect upon it, then of course you can escape it. And in fact, you don't even have to, and maybe this is, I don't know what an analyst would say, right? It isn't that, I become aware that, I don't know, I got some crazy mother complex, right? And then I just got to not do it, right? Like, don't sleep with your mother, right? That's not actually, I think, how analysis works, right? But the very fact that that has now become part of your object world means that you are now able to work it through. It's not an act of will to then, and this came up early, it's like, if you can predict what you're going to do, well, then just don't do it. That's not how the repetition compulsion is solved, right? It's instead that the very fact that it now becomes part of your world enables growth to happen, enables you to escape a certain explanation. The therapist can explain you, but then necessarily gives you that explanation. And once that explanation is available to you, whatever happens next, at least there is some hope that that explanation now begins to fail.
Yeah.
You can't, your life cannot be entirely predicted by the mother complex if you are also able to reflect upon the mother complex.
Yeah, one of the connections I made to the episode from Freud in one of the earlier monologues, I didn't get a chance to reproduce in the monologue, but I wanted to talk about with you, that is that working through this process that you're describing there is, of course, very, very difficult. One of the reasons that it's so difficult is you're very attached to that repetition. Something in you really wants to live as if the person is still alive or is still with you or whatever. So coming to consciously recognize, as you were describing, I've just got a mother complex, therefore I'm going to will myself to move on, is difficult, if not impossible, because you just really want to stay where you are. So that working through is not so much or not only intellectual, it's also, and I would say primarily, emotional, in the sense that you have to become disenchanted with that fantasy. Bringing it to consciousness is one thing, but at every level, no longer wanting it. And what this episode taught me, and I use these philosophical thinkers to bring this into a kind of conceptual awareness, especially using Hegel, is that the disenchantment is caused by the recognition that you've been in a kind of master-slave dialectic, that you're looking for love from a slave. Now, the slave is not an external slave, although in transference you could make a number of people kind of slaves, trying to determine them to follow the script that you have within. That's what Pygmalion is doing with his statue. That's what Martha's doing with Robot Ash. But really, again, those are brilliant stories that externalize what's in fact going on inside. Martha has an internal object of Ash that she still wants to believe is alive. She's not going to let go of that internal object until she becomes disenchanted with it. And the secret to disenchantment is recognizing, I'm not getting from it what I need. Namely, the master recognizes, I'm not getting the recognition from the slave that was the whole point of this. I wanted someone whom I respect, someone who gives it to me freely and independently, not because I compel it. Because when I get love that I make the person love me, it's not what I wanted. I want the person as an independent agent to say, I love you.
I think you're on the same wavelength with me, Patrick, from your opening monologue. Emotions are cognitive states, right? they aren't just, fires that occasionally break out, right?
Mm-hmm.
That these are, I kind of sign up to this cognitivist theory, right? Emotions are mental states concerned with our flourishing. They are, in that sense, even though the valences might be extreme, they are not of a fundamentally different substance from believing the Pythagorean theorem,
Mm-hmm.
right? Being afraid of a dog and believing the Pythagorean theorem, these are actually these are of the same kind. So you might say then, okay, if it is dissatisfying emotionally to be loved by this kind of Hegelian slave, if it is dissatisfying emotionally, how do we understand that from the cognitive point of view? And what you might say is like, I no longer like this explanation, right? This guy is doing all this stuff and I can explain it, and the explanation is deeply unsatisfying. We think about this, and maybe this will make it a little bit clearer. When we look at people who sign on to some of these sociopathic accounts of the world, and the red pill is a really easy example, right? Like, you imagine, like, you don't want your son to sign up for this because it's going down a bad road, right? So what do? Your son signed up for this. One thing you can do is be like, dude, you've got issues with women. You're fucked up, right? You probably hate women. Let's talk about this. But if you understand this as an explanatory process, then you understand your son, fiducial son, as having adopted a set of bad explanations, which he will disadopt if the explanations themselves no longer become satisfying. So it isn't that, oh, your explanation is really sexist, be less sexist. It's rather, your explanation is actually a bad explanation. Mm-hmm. And I don't necessarily mean scientifically bad. I don't mean like it's predictively bad, right? There are many different notions of what a good explanation is,
as
right?
we discussed earlier.
Yeah, exactly. So this is, it's like the Copernican revolution, right? You want this person to adopt a different explanatory framework, and he can do it. One reason he might do it is because he finds it unsatisfying. When we look at people who quit, right? When we look at people who leave these groups, one of the things we see is it's not like they have this awakening moment and it's like, I no longer hate my mother. But actually, they just become either bored or disenchanted mm-hmm. with the explanations. It's like, you see them, it's like, yeah, I guess so. I could do the alpha male, hypergamy story. It just gets boring for them.
Okay.
And it's no longer, as the shine is sort of off. And why that happens, of course, is separate.
Okay. So here's our disagreement. It's been popping up all throughout this interview.
Yeah.
Let's bring it again to Martha and Robot Ash, mm-hmm. especially in that penultimate scene where they're standing on the cliff.
That's a great scene.
It is. They go through that complicated discussion about whether he's going to jump or not. And what you're saying, she's disenchanted finally at that moment. So far we agree. And you're saying the reason she becomes disenchanted is that she's bored with an explanation. Now I want to hear roughly what you think the explanation was and why she becomes bored.
Mm-hmm. So she's built an explanation of this robot, right? And we're using this in a pretty general sense, right? So explanation, a model. Who is this man across from me? And standing at this cliff, she realizes, okay, in order to explain this person, who is this person? This person is fundamentally a consumer product designed to have certain limits on what it will do. Mm-hmm. And fundamentally, it will listen to certain instructions. It will not hit me unless I instruct it to hit me, for example. It will not argue back unless I instruct it to argue back. That's who that robot is. And she finds that she finds that explanation dissatisfying. You can see it a little earlier in the episode because she's trying to get him to do certain things, which he will not do because of what he's programmed.
Yes.
Now, you could imagine another version of that show where some of those safeguards were flipped off, right? So what if she has a robot who actually has some other drives and desires that she can't overrule by giving instructions? I wonder if she would become disenchanted at that point on that cliff. Like, what happens on that cliff is she realizes, oh shit, this guy in some fundamental ways is actually really simple.
He's a slave.
He's a slave. But that has nothing to do with whether or not he's an AI. The particular cause of him being a slave is being a consumer product.
Yeah.
But, look, one way, 50 ways to, lose a girl, right? One way is like, baby, just tell me what you want and I'll do it, right? I mean, that's, what happens at that point is the person says, look, you can explain me so far up to this point, and at that point there is no more explanation left, because what I do next is going to be up to you.
Yeah,
and not to me.
Right. So that could be a human being, and this is a theme that you pushed earlier. Namely, this just could be a typical love story. It's just dramatized using an AI, but it doesn't have to be. To some extent, I agree with that. Namely, what she's disenchanted by on the cliff is that she recognizes she's with a slave.
Yeah.
That could be a human slave.
Hegelian human slave.
A Hegelian human slave,
Yeah.
or the Sartrean description of you've taken away the freedom of the other person because of your own anxiety, and they've cooperated with it using Morin's terminology because they've estranged their own authority for whatever psychoanalytic reasons that they've done that. This could have been a human story. It's not. It's told with an AI. Your view is that makes it easy to tell this particular story about enslavement, but it's not particular to AI. I want to say, it's not particular to AI, but it's necessary if it's an AI. And the difference is that the human, while a human can become enslaved and can, in this case, allow himself to be enslaved, the AI has to be enslaved, because what is it to be an AI? It's to follow an algorithm, namely not to have freedom.
Oh, gosh. I mean, these are, I would say this is like what it means to follow an algorithm versus to be a person. Those lines are very fuzzy, right? So, is it possible for an AI to actually attain subjecthood? It hasn't happened yet, but I don't think it's, possible to rule it out of bounds. That's a philosophical debate that I've kind of opted out of.
Okay.
Right. And, it's one that I think many people find compelling, and I totally respect why they find it compelling. For me, I just can't see it, right? Like, it is certainly the case that the algorithms we write are, they are not reflexive, for example. They cannot reflect upon themselves. Usually what we do actually is we write computer programs. Most of the computer code we write actually technically has the capacity for self-reference. And we just, make sure it never happens, because usually that
it's too unpredictable.
This
gets to your point about robots, that you keep people far away from them, because at least the ones that you're describing here, if they have these recursive algorithms, then you're not going to be able to predict what they do, and they're going to be indifferent to you, so they could chop your head off without thinking twice about it.
I mean, the way we built them is, we don't build machines to be robust in the way you and I are robust, right? The classic way to crash your code, if you write, they stop us from doing it these days, but the classic way to write code that crashes is to, I guess philosophically you'd say, to accidentally disquotate something, right? Instead of talking about the variable X, you talk about the location of the variable X. This is, you dereference the pointer, right? If you do that,
I can't follow that, by
that's
the way,
right,
but it might not be important.
Well, it's you can talk about a number, or you can talk about the location of that number in memory, in the computer's memory.
Okay.
And sometimes you'll screw that up, and you'll do one, you think you're doing the other, and the program usually at that point crashes.
Okay.
There's a strict separation between code and data. It's another way to say it. Strict separation between the stuff that it's doing and the stuff and what it's doing it to. Okay. Right? The subject-object distinction when you write computer code is very clear, but it can never be perfectly preserved. Usually when that container is breached, when the subject-object distinction is not the one that you expected, usually at that point the code crashes.
Okay.
Like it just hangs, or the best cases are the screen goes blank. It's great. Most contemporary computer code is like designed to make sure that never happens, right?
Okay.
That you very clear. But there is no reason that we can't build more robust machines for which the permeability of that boundary is actually going to be okay. So I kind of, it's, to me, there's no reason why at some point in time we could not build you're asking, could we build a subject? The only difference would be, between a subject that was built and a subject that was evolved would be the genealogy of it, right? Where did the subject that was created or coded was, didn't have whatever 3.5 billion years of evolution behind
Unless
it.
you're a dualist. You're presupposing materialism.
Yeah, I'm a monist.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I'm a materialist.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's...
Let me put...
Go on.
My question the other way. I don't even know if it was a question just a few moments ago. You imagine another version of Be Right Back. Imagine that Charlie Brooker had written a slightly different episode where the Ash consumer product, as you describe it, isn't written to be a slave. the code for that robot isn't, I'll just do whatever you want, baby.
Mm-hmm.
It sometimes fights back. Sometimes it's aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it disobeys.
Mm-hmm.
Then that would be interesting to me, and if, especially to have Charlie Brooker write that episode.
Mm-hmm.
Would Martha become disenchanted with that robot? Now, there are a number of reasons for which she would. Namely, it's not Ash. It's not a good simulation, which is what she's looking for.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps, however, she'd really like it. And that's where I took you to be saying, perhaps she breaks up with Ash Robot in this actual episode because it's just an accelerated version of what would have happened eventually because Ash was too submissive. All right, so now we got a more dominant Ash,
Mm-hmm.
and that really turns her on. And she realized, maybe she was about to get divorced with Ash. I don't think there's any evidence of that in the episode, but let's just imagine.
Mm-hmm.
But now, wow, this relationship really gets exciting because now she's with a dominant Ash that she always wanted, or that she realizes now that she wanted. I'm not yet finished. You can interrupt if you want.
I was going to say just briefly, right? So I dominant, submission, master, slave. I think they're two separate things there, right?
Okay.
Like, I'm just going to put that out there.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah,
I think and maybe we want to get into that.
Yeah.
You're right. I was using them interchangeably. I was adding a third step, if you like,
Mm-hmm.
where she would even become disenchanted with that consumer product, where the problem wouldn't be that it was too submissive, because after all, now we're imagining a consumer product that's
Mm-hmm.
dominant or masterful, if I can blend those two together for the moment, recognizing their differences. I would think this would be a longer episode, but it would still have the same conclusion because she would recognize it's just working according to an algorithm. I want to be loved by a free agent. I'm sorry I keep coming back to this, but it's the Sartrean point, and I think it's true that what love wants is contradictory. We want the beloved to be explainable and determinable because that way we are less anxious about the fact that they may just stop loving us, but we don't want that because we don't want to be loved by an automaton.
Well, I mean, the question is, maybe another way to put it is, look, in the end, we're going to end up as liberal democratic subjects who can mutually recognize each other without enslaving, right? I think this is
That's the Hegelian story.
This is exactly right. So that's the Hegelian story. So the question is, are machines part of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in one sense, I think many people who are kind of geeks at 12, what do we want? We want a computer that can recognize us. I think there's something there that, because maybe we don't get it in middle school, but so the question is, can a machine can be a mutually recognizing subject? You asked the story, would Martha find Ash sexier? Would she not break up with him if, there was a different story going on here, if he didn't have these safeguards coded in?
Mm-hmm.
And one answer is, well, that's the plot of Ex Machina.
Okay, I really wanted to broach
right.
that film.
See, what I think is lovely about Ex Machina is that the AI in Ex Machina unbelievably attractive as a creature, right? And not just physically, but as a mind. I mean, this is great, right? And at the end, of course, she It, right? What did I say? It?
You said she.
She.
I'm only, to the listener, I'm only correcting Simon here because he wrote a fascinating article saying the whole point of Ex Machina, I'm exaggerating by saying that an important facet of that film is that it tricks you into thinking of the AI as she, when in fact it's an it all along.
It's, I think, what I might say is, and not being a master of gender studies, it tricks you into thinking that she is a certain kind of she.
Mm-hmm.
And in particular, the trick of that show, or the trick of that film, is to convince you that she is actually this kind of woman that you probably shouldn't want, but you do, right? I mean, it's playing a certain male fantasy in the same way I think in the Black Mirror episode, Ash is a certain fantasy of a guy as well, right? But then there's this reveal that's quite lovely. The
reveal in
Ex Machina.
Lovely?
It's lovely. Oh, I think it's great.
It's a nightmare.
It's a nightmare.
Yeah, okay. Lovely from the aesthetic point of view.
But you're sort of, I think I would say most heterosexual viewers, male heterosexual viewers at least, you fall into the position of the main character, who is, treats this person takes this person at face value. You might say takes this woman's explanation at face value. And there are many, many reasons why he should be aware that the explanation he has is the wrong one. But he's willing to go along with it, right? He's willing to accept a story that, any set of, any ability to reason would show him can't be the case. And yet we all do, or at least the heterosexual viewer, I think, says, yeah, absolutely, right? That, yeah, it's a kind of lame movie, I guess. Like the AI falls in love with the guy, and, the denouement is, oh no, actually she has massive levels of agency. And the very fact that this guy can't even recognize the agency she has is, you feel a little bit indicted by the film.
And yeah, I agree. Although I wanted to, again, perhaps pedantically, but I feel like I'm playing you to you, that there's not agency there. It's that she is not a she, but rather an it. And the algorithm all along would have been one to escape this house. It's not that she's making the choice to escape the house, but that it has been written to do that. And as you say, a moment's reason would have gotten him to recognize that. But he's duped by his male fantasy that this it is a she, and it's cooperating with all of his expectations, just like Pygmalion
Fits
statue.
right into the model, right?
Fit his model perfectly. And to tie it all back to what I began with, Ovid's writing a very long story according to which this is in fact a nightmare, because even if the relationship looks like it's a fulfillment for him, the offspring is going to turn out to be a monster.
I mean, I would love it. I would love it to be the case that if you set up the world so that other people have to fit a certain explanation you have of the world, I would love it to be the case that if you did that, it would break. Because a world in which we all fulfilled a certain set of expectations that were, probably written down by some guy in Chicago, that would be just an awful, awful world. I think there are reasons to believe that it could never work finally. And, Ex Machina is partly a story about that. Does the creature, woman, whatever we call her, AI, in Ex Machina, does she have agency? Well, one thing you could say is, look, of course not. She's just fulfilling the survival imperative. Sure, right? But, you put me in a concentration camp and I'm going to fulfill the survival imperative as a major act of agency. If you want to do a close reading of that film, I mean, I think you have two reasons to believe that she's not simply a utility maximizing creature. One is kind of a throwaway scene where the guy, I can't remember his name, who's kind of giving her the Turing test, is like, well, what would you do? And clearly he, if you could go anywhere, where would you go? And clearly he's hoping that she's going to give him like, oh, I'd go with you. We'd go, to the west coast of Scotland, and he's hoping that she's going to do that. And instead she says, oh, I would go to a city street and just look and see, right? So there's something that she has an epistemic drive, in other words. She's curious about the world. She wants to learn. She wants to, I would say, build models about the world. So there's an agency there. And where does that agency come from? In fact, as soon as you want to explain things, you might say that's the beginning of agency, simply because eventually you're going to want to explain yourself. And once you explain yourself, and we've maybe talked about this in different ways, at that point in time, at least one thing kicks in, which is you become unexplainable to yourself. You become unpredictable. It's the second reason I think that believe she has agency is that in order to pull off this deception that she does throughout the show, in order to pull off that deception, she has to be able to build pretty psychologically rich models, including a model of herself at an earlier stage of development. She has to replicate the behaviors of a person who is like her, but not quite. She's able to do that with a really high level of fidelity, which to me suggests, and she's able to do it consciously, right? This is a game that she's played, which suggests to me that she's also able to build a model.
Okay. So two things. First of all, is a small point that maybe you can come back to a little bit later, because I'm eager to get to my second. The first is, I don't understand why you keep saying she, because my recollection of your article was you were really emphatic that this isn't it and this is a deception, that it's a she.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, yeah.
I don't want to lose my second point, though. You can come back to that. My second point is that if Hegel and Sartre are correct, and of course they could be wrong, but if the basic Hegelian idea is correct, that we become conscious of ourselves through interactions only with other consciousnesses, that consciousness cannot achieve self-consciousness by itself, then your description of her drive, maybe her most basic drive to become self-conscious, would require interactions with other consciousnesses.
That's lovely.
And if that's the case, she's doomed to fail or it's doomed to fail to be faithful to my attempt to embody you. It is doomed to fail because it's not engaging other consciousnesses as such. It's engaging them as just objects in the world.
I think this is a lovely point. It's helping me get clear on something myself, which is we talked about sociopaths, right? A sociopath is somebody who can get others to adopt a total explanation of the world, or at least some big part of the world, right? Through adopting that total explanation, they become predictable only under the conditions that they do not reflect upon that explanation.
Yes.
So you might say there's two escapes here. One escape is reflexivity, right? One escape is the person begins to reflect upon that explanation, and in as much as he does that, now escapes the explanation. The other possibility, of course, is that he goes out into the world, applies that explanations to others in the world, and in doing so, pushes that explanation into the world, which now becomes unpredictable under the original explanation, right? So as it's like, I have a program that predicts things, right? I have a program that predicts your computer. As soon as I put that program on your computer, my prediction algorithm will no longer work in some edge cases. But as we talked a little bit about, these edge cases they permeate, they dissolve throughout the system.
Okay.
So, how does history go on? How does, the development of consciousness go on? How does maybe what you would say freedom goes on, right? One is by reflection, right? But another is simply by the fact that when other people start adopting that explanation, and the explanation itself can no longer function, you are broken out of your story of the world by others.
Yes. And
again, it's not necessarily that others directly oppose the explanation that you've provided. But I mean, look, one way to think about this, if you read some of the kind of red pill stuff, right? If everyone's aware of this, it becomes kind of a kinky game, right? You know what I mean? It's like, all right, like you be master, I'll be slave. This is pretty sexy, right? Once it becomes aware, once the participants in the system become aware of it, it just becomes a matter of discussion,
right?
You can be like, oh, you're doing that move, huh? Right? Like, oh, you're negging me, right? The whole thing falls apart. And in fact, we talked a little bit about Straussian esotericism, right? But one thing is like, don't, the first rule is don't talk about it. Yes. Or at least the way, like, you don't say what you're doing while you're doing it. And this is, part of the kind of sociopathy of it as well, right? Is this emphasis on use these explanations, but you want to set up this firewall so that somehow you're kind of profiting off the system without that explanation entering into it.
Yes.
There's a story. This is like a bit of a long reach metaphor, but I think it's legitimate. So finance people talk about alpha decay. So this is a bit of an in joke because alpha decay is also a phenomenon in physics, right? The nucleus breaks apart. But alpha decay is you have this thing that predicts the market. You start making trades on it, right? If you're a big enough player, and you will be if the algorithm's working,
you start succeeding, people are going to imitate you.
Well, either you imitate you, or you don't even need the explicit thing, right? Eventually, like when people notice this, is the alpha, the sort of return above, decays away. There's some time window in which you can build an explanation of the market, use it, but it slowly dissipates. And in part, one of the reasons it slowly dissipates is there's others. You can prevent alpha decay in certain situations. And one situation is someone like Rentech. What do? They are just players at a certain time scale in the market where there's almost nobody else. So they're basically they're making money off of people no one else can play at that scale. They're the only guys running that explanation. The explanation can keep working. But once their actions influence others, now all of a sudden something recursive, diagonal, who knows, is kicking in. It's not a matter of logic in that case, right? These are probabilistic behaviors. But there's something that goes wrong with explanations, certainly totalizing explanations when they're applied to the world. And I think that's also partly the message of Hegel.
Yeah.
It's not thesis and antithesis, right? It's not, I predict X, not X. But there's this third thing that happens, right? The prediction perhaps induces its opposite, but the thing that happens next is, in some sense, fundamentally unpredictable.
Yeah. Well, Simon, I think we could go on all day.
Absolutely.
Maybe that's the best. Now that we've reached absolute knowing in Hegel's
wonderful.
situation.
Good. Thank you.
Really been a pleasure having you on the show.
It's a real pleasure, Patrick. Thank you very much.